John Norman is here from Bonavista, Newfoundland.
So my name is John Norman. I am the mayor of the town of Bonavista, the most easterly community in North America. So if you remember the lyrics of the song, "This land is your land, this land is my land," from Cape Bonavista to Vancouver Island is generally the lyric that's used in Canada. Well, that's us. So we're jutting out in the North Atlantic. We are one of the 3 oldest English settlements in North America. So our English census documents were taken starting in 1642. We were seasonally settled before then by the Portuguese, by the Normans, and a number of other groups, European-based groups, Eurocentric, from the 1500s to about the 1620s. And then we know for sure permanent settlement by the 1640s. So it's quite an old English community. And I'm sure we'll draw some parallels between your area and ours, most certainly. Now, besides being the mayor of the town of Bonavista, which is a relatively new gig, it's only 2 years in, I am most known for being the chief operations officer and I guess creator of Bonavista Living and Bonavista Creative, which is a group of companies based in Bonavista that restore and preserve built heritage and landscape while enhancing the community. It is a for-profit operation, but I tend to have a pretty strong social lens when I look at things, so you just, yeah. So Bonavista Living and Bonavista Creative will make up a large swath of what I'm going to talk about today, but I will also touch on the groundwork that's been done in Bonavista over the last few years on townscaping, rejuvenation of our downtown core, Main Street areas, harborfront, and so on. But the company itself plays on all of that public investment that's been given to Bonavista that I'll show in more detail throughout the presentation. We build on a strong foundation of public investment over 20 years. We informally started the company about 9 years ago or so, myself and my girlfriend at the time, Leanne. And we moved to Bonavista. It was our hometown. We had lived away for 7, almost 8 years, went to school, and went back and got into our professional careers. And I was in education and academics at the local college, and she was in healthcare. And during those early years back in Bonavista, besides running for council and getting my hands in a lot of not-for-profit pies, I decided to start collecting built heritage in Bonavista. So we bought our first house in our first year home, at that time living separately with our parents, and the house was $21,000. It was a 1880s French cottage. It was a great deal. Came with an old barn, a carpentry shop, a root cellar. Really beautiful property. And that's where the base idea for Bonavista Living, Bonavista Creative really came from. This idea of preserving the community, its built landscape, monetizing it in a way that would benefit the community, enhance the lifestyle and vitality of the community, while self-employing myself and many, many others. So as I touched on, the history of Bonavista is quite a long one. And of course, being on the water, jutting out in the North Atlantic, it's traditionally a fishing community, a cod fishing community. And Bonavista was known for centuries as the cod capital of Newfoundland. And during those centuries, the cod industry, for the most part, was quite strong, quite lucrative for some, generally the merchant class. And that afforded Bonavista the opportunity to, by the early 1800s, 1811 is when the first architectural firm moved into Bonavista from Scotland, from Renfrewshire. And others followed, English and Irish architectural firms, in a town of about 4,000 people. We're not a big place. So it was a very well-developed and designed landscape as far as the buildings themselves. Now, you'll see aerial photos later on in the presentation that show that it's certainly not a well-planned out, gridded town by any means. It's a game of snakes and ladders, because many of the buildings are older than the road networks themselves. And we have a great archival collection of photos in Bonavista. We're still tabulating them, and it's ever changing, but it floats somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 photos. and photos of oil paintings prior to 1870 of Bonavista. And this is just a smattering, mostly Georgian and Victorian architecture, though we have over a dozen architectural styles in the community. And many of those buildings are still intact. We didn't really have a time where there was a major demolition push in the community. We were lucky for that. And much of that has to do with the cod moratorium. Click. So the groundwork really started for Bonavista not long after 1992. Canada's single largest mass layoff in Canadian history was the cod moratorium. Overnight, almost 50,000 Newfoundlanders lost their jobs, 10% of the entire population of our province. It would be the same as every car supplier, dealership, and base manufacturer in Ontario in the auto industry, 750,000 people losing their jobs tomorrow morning. So I don't think a lot of people really understand what hit Newfoundland at that time and hit communities like Bonavista. So, of course, growing up in the 1990s in Bonavista as a child, during the moratorium I was in grade 2 when it was announced, but I do remember it. I remember silence in the kitchen. Though my parents weren't in the fishery, everyone was indirectly connected somehow. And I remember kind of a depression setting into the community year over year from 1992 till about 1996, 1997, when Queen Elizabeth came and we had a big 500th anniversary John Cabot celebration. And that was big, and that kind of kick-started the idea that Bonavista could be a little bit more than codfish. It's the reason why most people moved there originally, hundreds of years ago, but there are other assets. And during the 1990s, there was a growing worry on loss of community vitality, authenticity, sense of place, and so on. Terms we throw around quite a bit now, but often wouldn't use or know about in the late 90s, early 2000s. So from that, the Bonavista Historic Townscape Foundation was formed, a not-for-profit organization that would operate at arm's length from the municipal council and receive annual operating grants, which they would be expected to use to leverage funds provincially and federally, predominantly through a COA. Now, the Townscape Foundation has, over the past 20-plus years, funneled into Bonavista over $40 million federal dollars. More dollars per capita than any other community in Newfoundland and Labrador, and a COA suggests to us actually more per capita than any COA dollars per capita of any of the 4 Atlantic provinces. All funneled through the organization that worked to restore the built landscape and take on some pretty significant major projects. One slide back. Back, 2 slides. Sorry. So they took on some major projects. And the biggest one, the landmark project, was the HPIP project, the Historic Properties Investment Program. There hadn't been anything like it in Atlantic Canada, and especially not in Newfoundland. And to my knowledge, and I'm pretty up on heritage work across Canada, there's been nothing like it since. It was a 5-year program that was predominantly funded by a COA, but in partnership with the municipality, the Townscape Foundation, our heritage and economic development arm, and the provincial government. And what it offered were very, very rich grants to private citizens for their private homes to restore them, and they only had to chip in 30%. 70% was picked up by the government. And you could choose to sell the house after it was done and pocket the money, although that was discouraged, and it didn't really happen very much. It was very successful. Over 3 dozen buildings were done in a 5-year period, mostly private residential buildings, through that program. And one of the main reasons the town and the Townscape Foundation suggested to have an incredibly rich grant system. I'm not overly familiar on if you have grant systems in the area here and those percentage and ratios, but generally provincial grants, province to province, don't go above 50%. In Newfoundland, they vary from 30 to 50%, depending on the building. That tends to be more conducive to higher income bracket summer home owners in rural areas. So the idea was to attempt to almost repel that type of investment early on in Bonavista's redevelopment and instead focus on the local residents and to grow their appreciation and stewardship for their own built landscape, their own buildings, their own private homes. From there, landmark structures were undertaken, large halls, churches, former schools, streetscape development projects, and a really significant investment was made over multiple years to reopen the Garrick Theatre, Newfoundland's oldest operating movie and live theatre. Right in the middle of our downtown, it closed not long after the moratorium while I was in junior high school, and it remained closed for about 10 years. Again, through funding agencies, federal, provincial, municipal partnerships, all managed by the Townscape Foundation, it was reopened as a social enterprise, a year-round cinema and live theatre with over 200 movie showings, a music festival, a year-round live schedule with 80 to 100 shows that tour the country. And that was a big focus for the Townscape Foundation, a focus on year-round livability within the community. The Townscape Foundation and various municipal politicians at the time, which I can't take credit because I was in junior high, I was on the school council at the time. The funders and the Department of Tourism and many others didn't want to see movie theaters supported. That wasn't a really good idea, but we made a business argument for it. Because Bonavista always had a long, long history of movie theaters because we had an American Army base for a long, long time outside the community. So movies were there as soon as movies were made. And the other big piece was this idea of a seasonal theater, a tourism-based theater. And tourism is not a bad word, and certainly not a bad word, I'm sure, here, I wouldn't think, or in Bonavista. It's a core sector, but there was a concern that a seasonal theater, as other communities in rural Newfoundland have, would actually have a negative impact on the vitality of the community year-round. It would focus the community's economy more and more to be seasonal. So the organization, the Townscape Foundation, fought for about 3 years. There was money on the table, and they wouldn't accept it until the government partners agreed to make it a year-round venue, because the business plan worked, and it was 50-50 for visitors and for locals. So, from there, click. The infrastructure in Bonavista was greatly enhanced, predominantly the heritage infrastructure. And it was celebrated locally, provincially, and nationally by 2014. Prince Charles gave us his award. And he gives one Prince of Wales award to a single municipality in all of Canada annually. Newfoundland has only ever received 2, downtown St. John's and Bonavista. I think Lunenburg received it in Nova Scotia as well. I'm not sure who may have received it in New Brunswick. And it celebrates enhancement and revitalization through heritage, built landscapes, natural landscapes, culture, the arts, and so on. And if you get to know Prince Charles, he's really, really interested in all that sort of stuff, and he does it in various Commonwealth countries. So we have some tangibles. We have a lot of government money injected into Bonavista for many, many years. So evidence suggests that this had a really positive impact on community vitality, on stabilizing the population, and encouraging private investment, and that's where we come in. So the Townscape Foundation, with its HPIP, with its streetscaping and so on, did major, major projects throughout the community to build this critical mass, to approach that palatable time for private investment, which is now in Bonavista. The public building, a great example. For some reason, everything in Bonavista was asphalted or graveled in the 1970s and 80s. No one wanted to see anything green anymore. So a lot of these spaces were reverted back. We went from a town of having over a dozen parks to, in the 80s and 90s, having almost none. And now we have 17 parks and parkettes and public gardens in a town of 4,000. So we can just quickly go through some of these. Again, before and afters of some of the restoration work that the Townscape Foundation did. That's our library, our Orangeman's Lodge, the largest wooden hall in North America today, 21,000 square feet, 5 stories high, designed by the Strathy architectural firm that settled in Bonavista in 1811. The Keogh Shop is a good example of how public investment is sometimes needed to save a building that doesn't make business sense for any private investor. Even myself, I've taken on multiple projects that tend to break even or lose, but this was far too big an initiative. This building was in the way of a crab plant expansion on our harbour, an 1840s mercantile building, a book agent house. It had to be jacked up, cut into 3 pieces, rolled up Main Street, and plopped in an open lot where we had lost a building in the 1970s, and is now owned and operated and leased out by the Townscape Foundation. The Garrick Theatre, that's basically what it looks like today, the orange building with the copper dome. Some points of restoration, inside and out, the old falling down ceiling, moldy carpet and blue chairs versus the modern day $6.5 million theatre we have. It's quite spectacular, all done in the Art Deco style. HPIP property, in the 4th and 5th years of the HPIP, they got into commercial properties. In the first 3 years, only residential were allowed. This is what I remember in the 90s, closed up shops, now rejuvenated, and private residences, like this one. It's an 1800s property, 1870s, 1880s. It's an 1886 property. It was vacant for over 25 years, mostly moratorium-based. Lots of people moved away, just boarded up their houses and left. So a lot of these are rejuvenated. Next one as well, this was a condemned property by the town, slated for demolition. The Townscape Foundation, in partnership with the town, stepped in, found someone to accept a HPIP grant, and restored the property. The same, an 1830s farm cottage, fully restored, that was slated for demolition, now provincially designated, and a smattering of some of the work that's been done around town. So as a result of all that public investment, Bonavista is celebrated provincially by the Heritage Foundation of Newfoundland, by the Department of Tourism Culture, for having the most significant inventory of built heritage restored in the province, by far outside of St. John's. When growing up, as I referenced earlier, I would be able to look at night as a teen across the harbour, and almost every building in this photo was boarded up or the windows were smashed out. They were all vacant. Half those streetlights were turned off as well, because it became so dire in 1994, 1995 that we had to start turning out streetlights because the town couldn't pay its bills. And from all that public investment comes the idea of this capitalization on sense of place, that private operators now need to step up, real estate developers, business owners, entrepreneurs, and carry on what has been done in Bonavista. There's still lots of public investment. Certainly a few million every few years seems to flow in for another big ACOA-based project in partnership with the Townscape and the town. Still a very active organization. But now there are mirrored projects that are private, like Bonavista Creative, Bonavista Living, and the Workshop. And this idea of utilizing the place capital that Bonavista holds for business. Because I don't know how it is, I've said this in Miramichi and in Sackville and all on the way, and on a podcast, I don't know where that's going, yesterday. And in Newfoundland, private investment business tends to get more respect from government as opposed to not-for-profit endeavors, and social enterprise and cooperatives and so on. I'm sure that varies from province to province, but the end goal was always for the government funders to see significant private investment coming as a result of their investments. So there we are. So Bonavista Living was the start. Bonavista Living was an idea that came when Leanne and I moved back home to Bonavista, and we bought our first little cottage, and we started restoration on it. Luckily, we both had good jobs, so after year one, we hired someone to restore it. And during that time, burdened with no student loans and no real debts, walking into professional careers right out of university in rural Newfoundland, we decided to spend our money in a slightly different way than the average millennial at the time in their mid-20s. We went around Bonavista and started identifying properties that we thought needed saving. So Bonavista Living basically focused on residential properties only at the start. Formally incorporated 5 years ago, it started about 9 years ago, informally, while we were in those careers, collecting a few pieces of property. Then, about 5 years ago, I had no breakdown. I just quit my job and my career. And Leanne stayed in hers. And I decided with friends to put everything into Bonavista Living, this idea of restoring heritage homes. Bonavista Living now has about 45 residential properties in Bonavista, and we buy and sell every year, so the number fluctuates. Might not be 45 this week, but it was a few weeks ago. These properties are selected based on, of course, the historical significance, who lived there, how it's designed, the placement within the community, within the neighborhood, within the community. And then there's always the level of threat in which they're under. The second property Leanne and I bought together, year 2 of living in Bonavista, was a falling down property that had sunk about 2.5 feet below the road. And it was an 1840s brothel. It was the last standing brothel, house brothel, in Newfoundland. That was historically documented. And without much heritage protection at that time in Bonavista, those bylaws were in their infancy, it was to be creamed and replaced with a bungalow. So in the dead of night, I couldn't have that. I knew who was planning on buying it and demolishing it, so we stepped in and bought it out from under them and saved the property. So it really went from there. And this is just a smattering of some of the houses that we're working on, various stages of restoration. The larger photo over to the right there is the house I'm currently living in. It's the second heritage house I've occupied in Bonavista. That was during restoration. It looks a bit prettier now. Yep. And then the next slide is just more restoration that we've done throughout the community. And what do we do with all those houses? We restore them, of course, try to save as many as possible. Many of them are vacant that we tend to buy. We turn them into accommodations because tourism is certainly a strong, growing sector in Bonavista. Fastest tourism market on the island of Newfoundland. Grew 21% between last year and this year alone. And I think 17 or 18% from 16 to 17. So fast growing, need for more accommodations. Vacation rentals, affordable housing units. We know that with these types of investments, we've spent many millions of dollars, non-government dollars, of ours in Bonavista on these homes. That's, we would hope, going to increase real estate values a little bit at least in certain neighborhoods so that we can at the very least get our money back. So we sell some and we create some as affordable housing units at the same time, not to displace people out of certain neighborhoods. So with that, I kind of have to see it with drone footage, of which I don't have brought with me, this awakening of Bonavista and these before and afters of the homes that we do, very similar to what the townscape did, but of course now all private dollars. We don't get any grants, and I don't tend to generally apply to any. There's way too much conflict of interest and red tape, as I tend to sign off on the municipal grants as mayor. So the hope is, or was at the start, to awaken dead zones within the community, to maintain and enhance authentic spaces and places within the town. And then the next few slides are simply before and afters of what we do. This home, for instance, was $7,100 when we bought it, oceanfront. Tremlett House, known as Tremblay Hall by the provincial government, is provincially designated. You can get a scale of the house by the people standing out front on the cement step. It's a pretty large home, beautiful Newfoundland vernacular. It's a Victorian photo the year after it was built in 1901 with the Tremlett family outside, successful fishing family. The middle photo when it was used as a horse barn for about 20 years, the dining room anyway, and there was a hole cut in the side. And now the posy trimmed walkway up to the main door to my house. It's quite a spectacular property. A lot of the original features intact inside and out. They were in hard condition, but a lot of that fabric could be saved. And then there are homes that are slated for demolition or officially condemned, and we try to overturn those with the help of our Red Seal carpenters, our crew, our engineer, and jack them, move them, save them, like Frederick Mulland House. And you'll see with the next photos, there wasn't a lineup of buyers for this one. This was the day we bought it, not after gutting. This was a home in very hard shape. Paid a little bit too much for it, actually, but it's in the middle of a provincial heritage district now, so we'll see where that goes. It's still under restoration 3 years later. Heber Rolls house, before and after, I think that one was $10,000 or $12,000 on a hill overlooking Bonavista Harbour, since sold privately. Nice shot of the ceiling when I walked in, the first day we bought it. Sometimes I buy things without ever going inside. I do that a lot, actually. This is an interesting property. Harrison Hicks House is the most modern home in our real estate collection residentially. And it's the first catalog home to have been built in Bonavista in the early 1950s, right after Confederation. Modern, well, quote unquote, modern architecture, mid-century architecture, started moving into Bonavista in the 1950s, 60s. I love this one because somewhere along the way, someone decided that they didn't want a window in their bedroom upstairs, and they just got rid of the window in the dormer. It's interesting. And a lot of the original features were saved in this home as well, mid-century features. It's very in vogue now, especially with the millennial group. Randall House, 1899. Again, fairly modern architecture for Bonavista. Anything that's around 1900 or later is pretty new. This one was slated for demolition. Now in a municipal heritage district or heritage cluster. We bought this house and 6 houses surrounding it, so we have 7 in that neighborhood now. This one's going up for sale this summer. So from there, after about a year of operating Bonavista Living formally, about 5 years ago to 4 years ago, trying to restore these homes with contractors before we built much of our own crew. And before much of Main Street redevelopment really started to heat up, I took a trip to, well, I take a lot of trips, but this particular trip I took to rural Massachusetts in the Berkshires. It's about 2.5, 3 hours from New York, 2 hours probably from Boston, inland. And I based myself in the town of Pittsfield, which had been, as many rural towns, you'll hear they've lost their fishery, they've lost their lumber, they've lost something. Their big manufacturing, fill in the blank here. Well, Pittsfield used to be the headquarters for General Electric for the US, this rural place in Massachusetts. And it employed, of course, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. They were all paid very well, and they were there from the Victorian period to the 1970s. So GE created quite the built landscape in Pittsfield. And then when GE, as well as Kodak, which had a smaller operation there, but still pretty significant for the US, for rural US, they both pulled out in the 70s through mid to late 80s, completely gone by 1990. And the town, like Bonavista, was left with a beautiful landscape, if you could look past the broken glass and the peeling paint or the cracking brick. And the real estate, for the most part, was either handed over to a local historical society or in foreclosure, handed over to the municipality for $1 to save these companies on their liabilities. So they had these assets. And like Bonavista did back in the late 90s when they formed the Townscape Foundation, and they did this asset inventory and felt that the biggest asset moving forward for the town was the over 1,000 built heritage structures in the town of Bonavista. Well, Pittsfield was similar. It had hundreds and hundreds of pieces of built heritage, almost all underutilized, tremendously undervalued. So I thought, this is really interesting, because what they've done here is created something called Berkshire Creative. I said, well, I think we really need to do something like that in Bonavista, this kind of pseudo-social enterprise. I'm a bit of a control person, so I didn't want anyone else to do it. So I'm going to do this because it's going to rejuvenate our main street, above and beyond what the Garrick Theatre has done and a smattering of other investments up and down the street, because there were still 8 or 10 vacant buildings between every building that was actually occupied and restored, like the Garrick and a coffee shop and a few others. What Pittsfield and the Berkshires region did was practically give away through leases or long-term rents for $1 a year in some cases to creators and lure these former urbanites from New York and Boston and Philly and other areas into their region to create a creative economy based around inventors, designers, painters, sculptors, chefs, unique niche manufacturers, software developers, architects. And basically, to simplify it a great deal, they just gave them these spaces at almost no cost to get them in, to get them settled, to stimulate activity and hype in the region. So this is exactly what we need. Bonavista's on its way up, but it's still a little slow. And we're doing a couple houses a year, we're selling them successfully, but I don't want to be selling to people living here just a few months of the year. I want people to live in Bonavista year-round and love the town. So Bonavista Creative was developed. While I was in the Berkshires, I called home and called my one employee at the time, Karina, who is now my CFO, and said, I want you to immediately tomorrow morning look around, call around, contact who you can, and see what commercial buildings are available downtown and along the harbor. There were for sale signs on nothing, but there was a heck of a lot boarded up. So certainly people might be interested in liquidating. They just didn't think they could sell it. So she did go about her business quickly and had offers in on over half a dozen properties within 7 days before I even got back. And this whole idea was based around placemaking. And this fairly new to North American idea in the last 10, 15 years of planning, design, and management of public and sometimes private spaces. Tremlett House, for example, I consider a semi-public space. Now, Leanne doesn't. She doesn't love the idea of people coming inside my gate and taking pictures sometimes. But I feel myself a steward of the building. We, on paper, own a lot of buildings in Bonavista, but I'm not going to live forever, I don't think, and I don't think anybody is. So one would assume these well-built structures will have other owners, as they've had owners before me. So it's this idea of really trying to enhance and appreciate the places that exist within the communities, that people have connection to. And this will enhance the community's well-being, its happiness index, and so on and so on. And we can get academically into some really fluffy stuff. But it's all about trying to encourage inspiration and excitement around communities' existing assets and its unique identity. In some form or fashion, pretty much every town should have its own unique identity. And there's always a few that just don't. They're generally along a highway and they just have some strip malls and gas stations and nothing really significant happened there. So it is a bit harder to enhance place in those places. But for those of us that are more steeped in history or culture or unique natural landscapes or built landscapes, it comes a bit easier. So a good example of placemaking in Bonavista was adjacent to the Orange Hall. In 2009, I formed the Bonavista Horticultural Society, but we had a gardening society, a club, mostly women at the time, in the Victorian era through to the 1930s, 40s. Wives of the members of the Harvard Club and the Oxford Club and so on got together and had garden spaces around town. Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, asphalt and gravel seemed to be the love affair in the 1970s and 80s, so the Orangemen next to their hall decided to destroy the public garden, the English public garden, next to their hall for parking. Great idea. So in 2009, we formed our horticultural society. In 2010, we partnered with the Townscape Foundation and said, we want to reinvigorate this place, this space within the town. And we want to make a collection area for people. We have a lot of gardeners in Bonavista. We have a lot of people interested in beautifying the community. Let's start rehabilitating some of those that we've lost. And so we did. You can see the evolution there over a couple of years. It's far more lush with some bigger trees now, but it is getting there in just a few short years. A far cry from the gravel pit it was. So this all ties to the place identity of who we are and how we connect with the places and spaces in which we live. Yep. So Bonavista, vast coastal plain, covers about 32 square kilometers. The photo here, which covers 2 heritage districts within the town, represents probably about 15% of the community. But you can get an idea from this picture of the interesting road network and the beautiful layout of how everything is so nicely gridded in the neighborhoods. Of course, many of these buildings were built, most of these buildings were built before automobiles, and many of them were built before there was even a lot of horse and cart use in Bonavista. There's a lot of 17, early 1800s buildings in this photo, and a lot of people just walked around town at that time in Bonavista and used boat. So this gives you an idea of, well, one, the public garden in its infancy there. This is a couple of years old now. Next to the Orange Lodge, that was all gravel before, and there was no charming white picket fence, and the carriageway next to the Orange Hall was gone. That was gravel too. But there is this kind of large pond in the middle of the town. It's actually a tidal pond. There's a man-made canal system that goes through this neighborhood and goes out to the main harbor, the outer harbor. Quite a charming little spot now. Growing up, this was the main sewage outflow site in the town from the 1960s to the 1990s. And there were some charming names for it, and no one wanted to live around that part of town, obviously, because when the wind blew, it was unpleasant. So again, part of enhancement of the place within the community was not just the built landscape and the formal gardens that were created over the centuries and we wanted to rehabilitate and reestablish, but the natural environment. That this harbor pond historically gave access to a lot of fishermen to come into the canal system, which was man-made for this purpose, from the main harbor where the merchants controlled much of the frontage, through the canal system with their little boats, and could park all around the pond. We have archival photos of that, not in these slides, unfortunately, next to their houses, deeper into the community. The canal never really worked. It kind of silted up, and the flow wasn't great, so what better place to dump sewage than a place with no flow? So the town decided to clean it up. There was a historical connection, especially by the older generation, the 75-plus group at that time, in Bonavista, to what they called their inner harbor, their harbor pond, for the fishermen, not for the merchants. Fishermen owned all the frontage around the pond. Enough room for almost 100 little boats. So the town wanted to rehabilitate the space. Dumped in a whole bunch of bacteria, did a big cleanup surrounding and within the pond, built a 1.1 kilometer boardwalk encapsulating it, and designating it a provincial protected wetland space with a green buffer zone, and now a provincial bird sanctuary. And now it is a place, 12 months of the year, where predominantly locals, but visitors on occasion, but it's kind of unknown. We don't really showcase it very much to the visitor. There aren't a lot of maps showing it and a lot of signage, because it's kind of behind everyone's houses. You kind of happen upon it if you maybe walk up the side of one of the canals. But it's a place. It's a place where Joe and Martha, when they're out on a walk around on a Sunday morning, will bump into so-and-so and what's-his-face and have a chat. When 10, 20, 30 years ago, those spaces no longer existed in Bonavista because they were paved over or graveled over or sewage was dumped in them. That place for interaction and the place where community spirit is born or enhanced was all but wiped clean for much of Bonavista. It was a driving town. You can drive right up to the post office, you can drive right up to the bank, you can practically drive into the porch, the lobby of any building. As little human contact as possible. So we've really pushed hard to go in the opposite direction, reactivating walking paths and site paths and boardwalks and carriageways to, I don't want to say force, but kind of, force people out of their homes onto these places and spaces and talk and meet and greet, as was the tradition in Bonavista for hundreds of years, because it was a walking town. Okay, so the place identity often is tied to urban character. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be, really urban. Bonavista, as a side note, is the smallest urban municipality in Newfoundland, 4,000 people. There's 23 of us that are considered big towns. There's 200 odd that are small towns. So we have some urban character, but of course, like you, we have a lot of neighborhood character. And the neighborhoods tend to vary based on their topography, based on their architectural style, based on their age, and so on. And that gives them a unique place identity in and of themselves. And what you can do with this is capitalize monetarily and in other ways. The town, private business, not-for-profits, all can capitalize on this new trend of belonging, which you may or may not have heard of. It's a fairly new academic subject in the last few years in North America. It's been a little bit better understood and researched in Europe. The idea that millennials, myself and others, just like I did 5 years ago, are a little bit, stereotypically, not all of us, but some of us, a bit fluffy when it comes to life, a bit soft, a bit flippant, and I don't want to do this anymore and work at the college. I'm going to quit my job and do up old houses, even though my background is earth science and education. I know nothing of carpentry or business, but I'm going to do it anyway, because I have a passion for it. Well, a lot of people now, a growing minority group, they're still a minority group, but it's a growing minority group year over year over year throughout much of North America, including Atlantic Canada, early studies are showing, that there is this trend of belonging, specifically with the 25 to 40s, but there's a smattering of it through all groups, where there's a growing disconnect with their urban and often suburban lifestyle, subdivisions, strip malls, box stores, and they don't feel a connection to the place. They don't feel a connection to the natural environment, the built environment. It means nothing to them, and they simply go through it, go about their day from A to B to C. And this is problematic, especially for town planners, urban planners, and municipal leaders as well. We see it now. There are a couple of great examples that I tend not to list in Newfoundland, but they are towns that tend to be on the Trans-Canada Highway. People drive through. They're a little bit more transient in our province, and they're generally the younger towns because they're inland as opposed to on the coast. And some are a little bit void of character, and they're a little bit sprawling. And in some of the neighborhoods, home number 1 is the same as home number 5, as home number 9 and 13 and down the line, because the design repeats every 4 or 5 houses. And there is this group of the creative class that doesn't want to live there. And sometimes they live there for a short time, and then they realize it. And then they move. They move to urban or semi-urban areas that are dense and have more character, right downtown. Or the group that we're looking at, they move to a rural area because they associate, sometimes incorrectly, but we can capitalize on it anyway, that this urban lifestyle that they have, because they have an hour, hour and a half commute from this subdivision to the center of the city where they live, and they can't afford to live downtown, they just don't want it anymore. And now I've got little Sally and little Bobby, and she's 3 and he's 7, and what kind of life are they going to have? Because, I had, or my parents had, or my grandparents had this farm, or this seaside fishing house, and they had a certain lifestyle that I want my children to have. And that is a thought process that's still a minority group, but is entering more and more the thought process of that cohort. So it's something we can take advantage of. So Bonavista did, through the work of the Townscape Foundation, our local chambers of commerce, our municipality, not-for-profit organizations, and private business like ours. We capitalize on the fact that Bonavista is an urban-rural hybrid. We're considered officially the smallest urban municipality in the province, and we are the largest rural municipality in the province. We are the largest outport, or the king of the outports. The outports are basically any town, jokingly, off the Avalon Peninsula, outside of the greater St. John's area in Newfoundland, because generally you would go from outport to outport by boat, because before the Victorian era, Newfoundland had no road network and had no trains. Everything was along the coast with coastal boats. So you were going along the outports. And because of the history that I've already mentioned and the density that we have in built landscape, and all these buildings are still standing, we have this kind of borderline urban sophistication. We have created multi-purpose use for a lot of these spaces that no longer have the original use in which they were built for. We have a fair density of urban amenities, and we have this growing urban sophistication, culture, focus on heritage, the arts, and creative thinking and learning, and so on. And as a result, since 2014, when basically our work started to marry what a lot of the not-for-profits had been doing, but as private business, we got a lot more press and we got a lot more coverage because of it. A lot of these belongers want to move in. These former urbanites, they want to be somewhere, connected to somewhere. And the average age has been falling year over year over year since 2014. In this rural municipality, 3.5 hours from the capital city, an hour and a half off the Trans-Canada, at the very end of a dead-end highway. You don't accidentally drive through or to Bonavista unless you're not long for this world, because the next stop would be the ocean and Iceland. So we had to develop something to draw people in and to keep the people that were there, and to bring back those that had left the generation, well, my generation basically, that had left. And so we did. So it was all tied to this idea of place identity. This idea of meaning and significance to connection of place that locals certainly feel strongly, I'm sure many in the room do, to their places that they identify and connect with within their communities. But deeper, it plays into how one, this day and age, has a conceptualization of themselves and who they are. Who am I? Well, I have to say, I'm from Bonavista. I'm a Bonavistonian. Or I'm a Newfoundlander. I mean, you go to Newfoundland, they'll always say, I'm a Newfoundlander. They generally won't say I'm a Canadian. That's second or third down the line. It generally goes with what you're most connected to. Firstly, my community, then my province, which was a country, hence the strong identity with Newfoundland, and then Canada, and then on and on. So that's what we've done here, and that's what we continue to do in Bonavista. The photo here is a great example of an open meadow that's been an open meadow since the 1730s, 1740s. Overlooking Bonavista Harbor, it is now a protected green space in perpetuity in the middle of town. It was, since at least the Victorian period, because we have photographs onward, the tobogganing hill in town. And there have been many developers interested, and the answer has been no. And there's a lot of cases like that around Bonavista, especially lately. We're actually in a very hot rezoning discussion right now with a 50-room oceanside hotel on a coastal outcrop. It's a colorful conversation if you look up Newfoundland media. But we put our heels in on some of these things. Some of us pretty strongly now at the council level, at the volunteer community level, and others, and rightfully so, because we value what we have, who we are, and of course a place always has to change and evolve, but it has to be done carefully, thoughtfully, and with a long, long plan in mind, a master plan. And Bonavista has that is updated every 5 years. So this sense of place, as I mentioned, evokes feelings. And these feelings can sell houses, can sell commercial properties, can lease commercial properties, can be a major tool to enhance your community. So we've done that through green spaces, through graveyards, through all sorts of unique crooks and crannies around the community that scream Bonavista, that scream our heritage, our identity, our uniqueness to the world. And that is now what sells that authenticity that Bonavista is branded and known for within the province of Newfoundland and beyond. This is a great example of placemaking within Bonavista. Overseen and partially funded by the Townscape Foundation in big partnership with ACOA and the provincial government, along with, I think, 10% from the municipality, the Harbour Promenade and the lawn, the public lawn. All these buildings were derelict, boarded up after the COD moratorium. I just remember all of these in complete disrepair with holes in the roofs and broken out windows. I remember all this sod and boardwalk area being rotten wharves falling into the harbour, and everything that sod was gravel, because that's where the fishermen parked. And in the town plan, it was decided that connection to place had a lot to do with connection with the natural environment and the water, the harbour. It's why everyone was there for hundreds and hundreds of years. So we want to get as close to it as possible on the side of the harbour that isn't utilised by the fishery now. We have a pretty sizable harbour. So we took this corner, the Townscape Foundation, the municipality, and between 2013 and 2014, and there's an old photo, 2014, because there's now benches put in, created the public lawn and the harbour promenade, or the harbour boardwalk. And people use it. Locals use it all the time. Kids are rollerblading down it, and they're biking on the section that you can't see in the photo. They're projecting movies at night on these buildings, the Movies on the Lawn series. And the public lawn itself, on the night of Bonavista Days, which is our municipal festival, we have a big, big fireworks display. And we've done it for years and years, even during the bad times. And it's actually the biggest fireworks display outside of St. John's on the island. We spend a bucket of money on it. But the locals love it. All ages. I mean, 2 to literally 102. There's a seniors home just across the road from these buildings, and the 102-year-old was out last year watching the fireworks. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people cover the lawn that night. And just a few years before, they stayed home and watched it from their windows or their balconies. There was nowhere around the harbour to collect, to watch the fireworks. And they collect early, and they bring picnics, and they mill about for an hour word after the fireworks. And it is now a community place, a space for everybody to interact. And it's really amazing to see on those active nights. Yep. And then there is, of course, the placelessness. The idea of placeless spaces within communities. Loss of community vitality. I always can't see the audience very clearly here. Look at expressions when I put up these. I'm not going to lambaste anyone that has a Walmart. Just because we said no a couple years ago when they came sniffing doesn't mean that everyone is going to try to keep Walmart out or push out a Walmart they have, because Walmart and Kent and all the box stores serve their purpose. But that's exactly it. They serve their purpose. Not generally the community planner's purpose. They are generally a reflection of this idea of placeless spaces, where you can't really identify or connect with the area. There aren't a lot of them, but there are a few that are designed and nestled in neighborhoods where they've done a really good job. But generally they don't. Generally they're reflective of suburban sprawl. And I put up these photos, usually if I'm either speaking in Ontario or Newfoundland, because there are photos here from a suburban area in southern Ontario, suburban St. John's, Newfoundland, Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, suburban Wisconsin, and a community in Newfoundland called Clarenville, an hour and a half from Bonavista. It has the Walmart close to, although I don't think it's pictured here. That gives one away. It has the Walmart and the Canadian Tire closest to Bonavista, and it's on the Trans-Canada Highway. It's a young town, baby, only about 100 years old. So, which is which? It was really interesting to present this in St. John's at a lecture at Memorial University and have some city councillors from St. John's come and not be able to identify their city. 2 photos are St. John's, actually. And it is because they're designed in just that way. They reflect the brand of the store of the building. They're completely utilitarian in nature. They're meant to sell mass of products, nothing more. So they serve their purpose. For many of us, you will see me in a Walmart on occasion, and definitely at a Kent Building Supply store. But you won't see them in the center of Bonavista. And there are other municipalities in Newfoundland, a couple, and other good examples across Canada, that have tried to steer clear of this type of development where and when possible. Very hard to do, especially if you're in a slightly fiscally challenged environment and you're a municipal leader and you're trying to turn down big business. It's a hard argument to make. But these can do damage. And we have a great example that I won't name in Newfoundland of a town that is suffering. A town of between 5,000 and 8,000 people. I won't say the exact population because we'll be able to search it. And it is along the Trans-Canada. It is a relatively young town, under the 100 years. And it has a number of these types of stores. It also has dozens and dozens of subdivisions. And it now has, in not a large town, under 8,000 people, 241 homes for sale. Real estate is down 11% this year and 15% last year. And people from that town are moving to our town and to other towns. It was based on an oil boom in Newfoundland. There were mass production projects and oil platforms being constructed not too far from that community. So they capitalized on that and built quickly, and in some cases thoughtlessly. And as a result, they created a fairly transient community by default that people didn't connect with. They were there only as long as their job was there. And if they were in a trade, which a lot of them were, and then their spouses were teachers or social workers or doctors or so on, a government center created there and a service center created there. But once the boom ended and the bust began, because those are the ebbs and flows in the oil industry, you don't build platforms every year, then you're in trouble because you have a large group of people that have no connection to your community and no connection to places within your community because you are almost void of them. So, that comes to Gertrude Stein. And if you can't hold someone like Gertrude Stein in your community, then that's a problem. She would be, in her time, a member of the creative class, an artistic type, an inventor, a creator, a thinker. The type of people that this day and age you want to attract to your community. They often create the most jobs. And she wrote in her autobiography, "There's no there anymore," about her hometown, her neighborhood. She had no connection, no feeling for it anymore because this is what happened to it. And just outside of this shot is an industrial park. That's it. And again, this has its place and serves its purpose, and there is still the majority of the population that is quite satisfied with easy, manageable living, and I'm not going to down that. But there is that growing minority group that steers clear of this. And that's where, especially the rural towns, can take some opportunities if they're ready for them. So we spent a lot of years seeding optimism in Bonavista. And we created these spaces, these places. We started having festivals. And it was as simple as going down predominantly vacant, abandoned Church Street, one of the main thoroughfares down through Bonavista, and have a mummers parade. For those who are unfamiliar with the tradition, it's generally where men dress up as women and women dress up as men and parade around town in Newfoundland. historically, because we're all foolish. So I'm out of this shot, but I am dressed up as a woman pushing a wheelbarrow with my wife dressed as a man with a beer bottle, and she's hanging out the wheelbarrow. And we went down Main Street and didn't take off our masks till we got home. But we started doing these types of activities before Main Street was restored, while there were still a lot of vacant buildings. There's still a couple of vacant buildings on Main Street that we haven't tackled, the townscape nor our company. And there's always going to be some of those things that you just want to get done and you can't get done and you have to wait another 5 years, and that's it. But it's this idea of optimism. And in the same vein as Winston Churchill, I'm an optimist, and I just don't see the reason or the purpose of not being one. It's a complete waste of energy. It gets you nowhere. But I do find, and probably not here, I feel the community is quite vibrant, but a lot of rural areas suffer from a real pessimistic outlook. Their sectors are dying or dead, and they don't know where to turn. But I will say, crossing your arms and saying, oh my, this is bad and that's bad and everything's horrible, isn't going to get you very far. I've been to some of those towns too, and it's quite depressing. And you try to convince them that you have assets, you have A, you have B, you have C. Move on one of them. And they don't. And then you find out a week after you were there, they demolished 2 heritage buildings. Next. So that's where Bonavista Creative, our business number 2, comes in. Bonavista Creative is a pseudo-social enterprise arm of Bonavista Living. It focuses only on commercial properties in and around Main Street in the downtown core, Church Street and the Harbourfront. And it focuses on this idea of the creative economy that I've discussed in detail. And the idea that simply the old spend money, open factories logic, Trump economics, is not going to rejuvenate most rural areas. It's not happening. We best just face that. Joey Smallwood, a very famous premier of Newfoundland, promised us in an excited way many, many times, bouncing up and down like so with his bow tie, and it wasn't going to be 5 factories or 10 factories or 20 factories. There were going to be 50 factories around Newfoundland. And he'd say there were going to be rubber boot factories, and there were going to be car factories, and there was going to be candy factories. There ain't no factories. There were a few, and they closed because the economics didn't make sense. And it generally doesn't make sense when you look at transportation and labor costs and so on for the average manufacturing. Now, I'll get into the unique types of manufacturing we do in Bonavista and how successful that is becoming. But the old idea has to be washed away. Not going to work. We've seen communities, and I've talked to communities that are in Newfoundland, they're waiting for the call center to move in. 200 jobs. Ooh. And that happened to one town not too many years ago, and about 4 or 5 years later, just as quick as it came, it went. It closed within a week's notice, and 200 people were out of a job. And they left a big bungalow in the middle of town where the call center was. So we look to monetize place capital with Bonavista Creative. And we do this by acquiring buildings that can be occupied by members of the creative class. And these buildings are 50 years old, 100 years old, 150 years old, and they are predominantly located in a nice, dense cluster, in and around where the Townscape Foundation restored the Garrick Theatre and was operational by this time. A few other little buildings were done. There was a cafe that opened in an old apothecary, and there was a house that was restored through HPIP along the street, and a few things were happening. But in amongst those great projects, there were 2, 4, 8 derelict buildings and a couple of beautiful churches. Next. So we looked at the idea of monetization of place capital because we are a business and we at the very least have to break even. And we're really hoping to do that this year, 5 years in. We were close last year, and then I bought some dumpy garbage sites and because I had to save them, and it put us a little bit behind. But we all agreed as a shareholder group that it was the right thing to do. So I tend to have a strong social lens compared to some real estate developers. And it has all to do with what I've already discussed, this idea of making place and sense of place work for you, because generally, especially governments, municipal on, up or down, understand and respect revenues and jobs, especially in rural areas. That's what they're there for. Yes, they have to manage the community and its infrastructure, but you need jobs, you need to grow your community or stabilize your community. I mean, these are the big things that face most rural leaders. Faced me when I was on council 10 years ago as a young councillor. And so that's what we're doing. And reflecting on this new idea of ruritage, which is a UNESCO brand they launched last year at the UNESCO conference in northern Italy. And that's where I first learned of it, doing a completely different presentation on geophysics and geomorphology at the time, discussing a new endeavor we've been working on in our region on Earth history and celebrating Earth history. But ruritage was also discussed, and it is basically exactly what Bonavista's been doing and what many communities have been doing in Atlantic Canada. This heritage-led rural rejuvenation approach, capitalizing on existing assets. So Bonavista Creative and Karina, while I was away, left her kitchen table, her workstation, and went out and started collecting these buildings. Now, a lot of these are in restored state now. These are good photos, but you'll see now in the next few slides some not so hot photos. And these are just some of the businesses that we've been able to attract. We now have on our main street, in a 1 kilometer stretch, 7 businesses that export year-round, multiple businesses that export internationally, 2 of which ship to over a dozen countries around the world. None of them existed 5 years ago. It's quite spectacular. Before and afters of some of what Bonavista Creative does, with the use of archival photos. This one was really far gone. They even removed the 2nd floor in one of the buildings. They removed the 3rd floor in this one. This one was turned into social assistance housing because it was a larger merchant class home and it was just too big for the average person to live in. So we turned it into an accommodation and happily relocated the people that lived there because the previous owner was, I would say, slum lord. And I think he readily and proudly admits it, actually. The Newfoundland Salt Company occupies this 1895 building. This is their storefront, and now they're looking for secondary space for larger scale manufacturing. They're shipping to 17 countries right now. They opened 2 years ago. Gosling House, I love it when I see torn down ceilings because that means a deal. So Gosling Cottage was a steal. And the Ford Tavern Vacation Home, backing right onto Bonavista Harbour, this was the brothel. Every young guy's dream. When I was 26 years old, 27 years old, I bought a brothel. And I toyed with the idea of reopening it as a bed and brothel. Period appropriate. They would just lift a skirt by a few inches. Of course, that would be completely inappropriate, but historically interesting. And the Linthorne Loft Vacation Rental upstairs, where the Linthorne family used to live, downstairs where their salmon exporting business is located. We now have 2 commercial operations. One is a year-round weaving studio by a fiber artist that's moved in. That's now actually moving out next year and into a building that is 4,800 square feet that we're restoring because she is opening Newfoundland's fiber mill. We don't have one. All our wool gets shipped to PEI in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and then sold back to us. So sorry, but we're cutting that off. And then we have unique partnerships. Another big reason why we're not overly profitable yet is we see buildings like this. This is the Alexander Bridge House. And William Alexander had this home built for him between 1811 and 1814. At the time, it was the largest standing private residence on the island of Newfoundland for about 2 years. Merchants were always outdoing each other. So every few years, the number changed and the location changed. But it was a significant home and still is today. The dormers are removed and in storage, actually. Plaster cast dormers. And even in this photo here, where they're excavating for an harbor extension in front of the house, a wing to the left of the house has already been removed in that photo. So it's had quite an evolution. But it's a pretty substantial structure. It's the oldest standing merchant home on the island of Newfoundland, and it's one of the most significant Georgian piece of architecture on the island. So it's provincially designated, quite likely to be nationally designated in the future. And it is owned by the Historical Society and managed by the Townscape Foundation. And of course, to leverage the public funds that are needed to help restore the building, Bonavista Living and Bonavista Creative have committed $200,000 toward the endeavor, which allows them to leverage about $1.6, $1.7 million to do the project. And finally, to clue up, we have our workshop. It was very costly and not very profitable at all for us to hire contractors to do much of our work. Bonavista had a strong history in architectural firms, master building firms, window and door manufacturers, and we shipped products like that all around the island and parts of Labrador for centuries. And one of these old carpentry shops, window manufacturing site, was still standing. So we bought it, restored it. Out of the photo, perfect angle taken there, Crystal did a good job. There's a big modern addition off the back. This is our window and door manufacturing site now, the Bonavista Creative Workshop. And we are the largest heritage woodworking shop on the Newfoundland. We ship all over the island, parts of Nova Scotia and Ontario, 50%. And then the other 50%, of which we make no money on, we build our own windows and our own doors and our own millwork and kitchens and fireplaces and mantels and do our own restoration work, therefore cutting all the markup that we had been paying in the early years. So we have the finest collection, the large collection of heritage carpenters and red seal carpenters now on the island working within our shop. And we do all sorts of work, modern and traditional, quite a mix. I think we have a slide of, next one, some of what we do. Interior shot of the old section of the woodworking shop, the window shop. And next. And some of the more traditional work that we do. So, to conclude, Bonavista Living, building on the foundational work that's been done by the not-for-profit sector, by all levels of government in our area, capitalized on sense of place and authenticity within the community. And we do our best as private operators to safeguard it. We have ourselves, just through our standalone real estate company, attracted 47 new residents in just a couple of years, with an average age of 33, to occupy our creative spaces and our homes, almost all of which were vacant prior to that. And they are chocolatiers and weavers and celebrated national level chefs and salt makers and bath and body product manufacturers that last year got into American Vogue 3 times and ship everywhere. Before they moved to Bonavista, it was a garage-based business in one of those trans-Canada towns, and they didn't feel that the town reflected the branding they needed. So in 4 years for us as a company, we went from myself and Karina at her kitchen table to now 51 employees, I think, is this week. We just hired one more. And we've helped support the creation of 11 new businesses just on Main Street. And at last count, they created a further 23 jobs in their businesses, all while enhancing the community and celebrated by the municipal office and certainly our chief financial officer. The residential real estate values in Bonavista in the last 4 years alone are up 64%, while the provincial average is down 17%. Of over 267 incorporated municipalities in Newfoundland, we're one of only 3 that have seen residential real estate increases in the last 3 years, because Newfoundland is, I won't say tanked, but it's in a really hard situation because of the fishery, the oil industry, and so on, and the price of oil. So that would indicate a pretty strong rural economy. There's still a lot of work to do. Things always look better on paper or on screen than they do in reality. We still have many buildings to do. We still have many businesses we'd like to see launched in our area, and we'd like to get our population up to where it used to be, between the 4,000 and 5,000 mark. I will mention, because maybe if there are questions after, I'm happy to take some, that during this 64% increase in real estate values, the municipality, before I was on council, and I am excluded from voting on it next year when it comes up again, voted 3 times in, I think, 5 years to drop their mill rate. So we now have one of the lowest mill rates in Newfoundland as well, because generally real estate values are increasing 12, 15, 18% year over year. And even after the drop in mill rate every year or every second year as it goes, we have seen in just the last 2 years while I've been mayor a 10 to 12% increase year over year in municipal revenue at the town hall, of course, which we can use those funds to leverage many other investments within the community. So it is quite significant. And that's it. That's what we've done in Bonavista. I always clue up by commenting on a very early meeting I had before we actually incorporated. And it was in a very small room in Bonavista's one and only hotel at the time. And we put out 30 chairs. And I was going to talk about what Bonavista Living and Bonavista Creative are going to do. And I had been on council 4 years prior to that in Bonavista. And around this time, when I did this presentation, I was not re-elected to council. Subsequently, obviously, I ran for mayor and got that 4 years later. But it had much to do with concern and resistance to change at the time within our municipality. And that's not the case in all municipalities, but it certainly was in ours, and I see it a lot in rural municipalities that I do visit. We have a coffee shop. We have a hotel. We have one of this or one of that. And the worry was, when I put out these 30 chairs and 88 people showed up in this little room, was that, well, if you do this, you're going to destroy my business. What do you mean another business is going to move in? What do you mean another B&B, you're going to open a B&B? I have the town's B&B. And that, it took a long time. My young, energetic self probably reacted a bit badly to that, but I pushed through. I lost my seat on council over it. And 5 years later, I proved with tangibles, as were listed in the previous slide, revenues are up, population stabilized, school enrollments have stabilized, public investments in infrastructure in the municipality are on the rise, and visitation has quadrupled in just a decade. And tourism is still only the third largest sector in Bonavista. It is working, the type of investment that we're doing. So, I smile when I see so-and-so, the owner of coffee shop A, or person C who owned the B&B, because they are busier than ever. And both with locals and the growing local population, but also in the fact that there are so many more visitors coming because we have reached critical mass. No one wants to walk down a main street where every second or third building is vacant, or not as many as you want to see, certainly. So now, last year, just on Church Street, one street in the town, there were 71,000 visitors just in the summer walking down that street that were out-of-province visitors. There weren't 20,000 5 years ago. And that now has resulted in tens of millions of dollars flowing into the community. So it, to me, is a victory, but one that has to be carefully managed. You can also be too tourism-focused and become too seasonal in nature, because tourism will, in essence, in Atlantic Canada, always be somewhat of a seasonal industry. So with Bonavista Creative, we hope to accomplish that. Yeah, so that's it. I'm open to questions if you like.
I don't know if you've been around, but there's a lot of great built heritage. And so one big concern is, how do we, as new things are coming in with new infill development, with major restorations, how do we make sure that that reflects what's already there? And I'm wondering how that worked in Bonavista, if that's a concern, if there's any policy, bylaw, thing like that.
New construction that looks like old construction. Is that the
Not
idea?
necessarily that looks like old construction, that
Okay, good.
reflects the
'Cause I argue
character.
I'm really against artificial heritage.
Yeah, me too.
Bonavista has architecture right up to mid-century modern that we celebrate, and now some modern architecture. Yeah, and Bonavista is known as architectural haven. I mean, we host schools of architecture, Harvard, Ryerson, Yale, every year for field schools. So I often point out the many, many architectural styles and periods represented and highlight the evolution of architecture in Bonavista. I like to push things that are sympathetic to certain neighborhoods when it comes to scale, but I'm against building a Victorian-looking house in a Victorian neighborhood just because it isn't Victorian. It wasn't built in the Victorian period. Some people love that, and if they want to build a Victorian house, so be it. But we don't force them to.
How do you make sure that there's still good design?
We have a design review process, and we have a stewardship review committee, of which I chair, and a member of the Townscape Foundation chairs, and a member, co-chairs, and a member of our management at the town hall also sits on there, and a couple of council reps. We are going through a couple of reviews right now. It varies from neighborhood to neighborhood. We have provincially designated neighborhoods, so provincial districts, heritage districts. We have municipal heritage districts. We have heritage clusters. And then we have, in some cases, the Wall West, where you can do almost anything. Those ones give me chest pain. But we're working on them because, again, a lot of this is in its infancy. Most of this and these regulations and bylaws didn't exist 10 years ago. So we're actually enlisting a consultant now. We started just last Monday on upgrading our heritage bylaws for 2 of our districts because we think they're a little bit old-fashioned, actually, the idea of building old. Yeah.
Thank you. Alan?
Yes, hello. I'm curious, you mentioned you had 7 new manufacturing businesses in the downtown. Now, do you believe, or what are the stats on you created that lifestyle and that environment? Are they new people that moved to town and brought their flavor to it? Is that what you feel?
All of them are new.
All of them new?
None of them have no historical connection, family connection
Very
or
good.
otherwise to Bonavista.
That's okay.
So we now have in Bonavista over 20 countries, nationalities represented, in a town of under 4,000, little under 4,000. We have on Main Street businesses that have been opened by newcomers from at least a half dozen Canadian provinces alone, generally former urbanites. And they generally tend to be the first wave and the most interested in taking risk. Now, the second and third waves coming through are those that are returning home. They may or may not understand what's going on, and sometimes their businesses may not work, but they try, and our local Chamber of Commerce supports them in a no-cost business counseling service that we offer. But we try to encourage people not to, oh, this shop is, opened up a couple of years ago. It's so successful. It makes soap. I'm going to make soap. No. How about you come up with your own idea and do something that's unique, because you have to understand why they're successful and why their branding is the way it is, where they ship and why they ship it and how they ship it, and how they've used their background to mold the product into something that will end up in Vogue magazine. That's the harder work now, is the idea that Bonavista is very, very successful in recruiting visitors off of the Avalon, outside of the St. John's area and its airport. And people want to cash in. And that is something that we've just started to really confront last fall, where there are so many accommodations opening and so many cafes opening that now, yes, the pie is being sliced a bit thinly too quickly, because I was always a proponent of the pie, growing the pie. But that takes years. It took us 20 years to get to here, over 20 years. So since mid-January, and we have no control over it currently because it's a free economy, we have approved 17 new accommodations since January. So a product of our own success, and a challenge now is how to control that and have a certain zoning density for accommodations, for businesses, and so on. So I know that diverts a little bit off your question, but I like to highlight the challenges. Not everything's hunky-dory.
So you brought up accommodations. How about Airbnb? Is that affecting?
That's
you?
the problem.
Yeah, okay, okay,
I'm trying to be nice.
yeah.
We have 89 in a town of a little under 4,000 people. They're on every street in every neighborhood. But they're going to max out because the visitation growth, however fast it is, cannot keep up. So people are seeing a slight softening in their traditional numbers this year for the first time in a decade. I expect a few operations to close, likely Airbnbs first in the next few years, because people from away from Bonavista bought a house, said, oh, we're going to rent that out for so many months of the summer, and then, I'll come if I want for a weekend. They just don't understand the detailed economy and the economics of it all. And I try to turn them away from it sometimes if possible, but that's it. Can't control everything.
Richard?
I'm sure there would be clusters of folks in your town who remember the cod fishing days. How do you, as the town evolves and changes, how do you bring those folks along as well? It's easy for the new folks coming in to accept that.
Mm-hmm. Those were many of the 88 that showed up to that little room meeting. I've gotten better at sympathizing with the frustrations and sometimes anger and resistance to change that has come up in Bonavista over the past 10, 15, 20 years, and the last 5 years with me. In that, I can't say the cod fishery was easy, because it certainly wasn't easy for anyone, I suppose. It's hard work, but it was almost automatic. Up until the late 80s, when there started to be a little bit of a slowdown, and then leading up to 92. But before that, people just went into the fishery. It was automatic. It was the sector of Newfoundland, it was the sector of our town. The big, big sector. Who would waste their time and money to go away to university and get a degree or two and become, say, a teacher and make less than the person working in the fish plant? So when that just shut down, much like the oil industry now, and a lot of people went into trades and so on, and again, hard work, and there is some training involved, but they opted for that as opposed to university or other directions. There is a general frustration that goes along with that, and I saw it firsthand in the fishery, and I saw it with many people that I graduated high school with that went into trades and oil in Newfoundland and Alberta, and when that slowed down, they were really upset, and I mean, some of them were losing their houses and their vehicles, and it was really quite sad. So it's understanding those ebbs and flows and sympathizing with those that expected to have a livelihood out of something. And there are some now today that still can't get over that fishery is gone. And I mean, we were promised it was going to reopen in a couple of years. In 10 years, 15 years, over 20 years later, the cod fishery is still not open in Newfoundland. There's no cod in the Bonavista area being processed. We're a crab processing facility now, and those stocks are getting sliced and diced. So we make hay and diversify now, is what I constantly tell people. And there are opportunities within what we're doing. I mean, heritage woodworking firms, carpentry trades, because of all this type of work, there are opportunities. I have a couple people that formerly worked in mega projects in oil that now work with us doing heritage restoration work. And it's understanding that you have to be agile and flexible in this day and age, because those ideas of going into 25 and 30 and 40-year careers are becoming very, very rare. But the frustration that goes along with it, changing their minds, that takes time, and there are some in Bonavista that I'll never change their mind. Actually, my phone was vibrating while I was talking, and it was actually an email from 2 citizens, and I know I'll never change their mind. They're very, very angry right now at something I've done, apparently, or said. That's it. But it's trying to, I found it became much easier the last couple of years. Obviously, I got back on council, and I ran against a woman who was the councillor that took my seat when I was a councillor. She was running against me for mayor, and she was head of the fisheries union at the plant. And I won by landslide. So, and I was shocked. But what I took out of that was people were satisfied with the direction that I wanted to take organizations like the Townscape, the type of work that I'm doing with my business, the Horticultural Society, and so on, this type of community development spin, as opposed to the traditional fix the sewers, pave the roads, and not much else we can do in the town of Bonavista, give the Townscape some money and keep the government dollars flowing. I thought a bit deeper, a little bit harder about where we wanted to go and how we wanted to do it. And with that came revenues, money, jobs. And once you start showing people jobs, they have a harder and harder time arguing you. And I'd say now in Bonavista, maximum 20-30% will try to argue with me over jobs and the success of what we've done and how we've done it. Most people understand, so it just takes time. 22 plus years for us.
Thank you.
And multiple volunteers. I'm just the latest wave. Yeah. And I don't want anyone to feel trapped. I mean, I can answer questions all day, so if you do want to go, I take no offense. I do a lot of lectures, and a lot of students either fall asleep or leave.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really well done. I spent some time living in Newfoundland, actually, quite recently, and I was able to do some community-based rural research projects. I'm a homegrown maritimer, so I am accustomed to a certain level of inclusivity and hospitality, but it was almost like a culture shock being in Newfoundland. It astounds me how hospitable and how welcoming everybody is.
Most of us.
Yeah, well, I was always really fortunate to have a lot of really special experiences, but I was just wondering the extent to which that social capital and that social cohesion sort of contributed to what you're doing there now.
There's a couple pieces to this. Early on when the Townscape started their work, that was all volunteer driven. So the social capital involved with that got us to where we were 5-6 years ago when I launched this and the group of companies. So that was incredibly important. I think the social capital we have now in Bonavista today, especially with the, I don't want to come across as ageist because I'm certainly not, but I'm on a lot of committees with a lot of 60 and 70 plus, especially Horticultural Society and historical societies. And these millennials that are moving in have had a snowball effect. They attract their friends, which attract their friends. And the best example I can show when it comes to social capital was 6-7 years ago, we started Church Street Festival, with the Mummers Parade and so on, as the infancy of Church Street being redeveloped began. And it grew into a week-long festival, weekend to weekend now, with 80 events. And I was on the committee. And again, not to be ageist, but everyone else on the committee was 50 plus. That was a committee, 7 or 8 of us, mostly retired individuals. And now, not that anyone was booted out, volunteers that were there were thrilled when over the last few years, the committee completely became everyone under 40. And a new energy and new ideas have flown into it, and they can say, thank God I can go and do something else now, because they felt almost obligated because there was no one to take their place. And that's again why I really harp on trying to get young, energetic people into an area and involved in an area, because the human capital it takes to get this type of stuff done, to get festivals and town planning and events moving and things like that is really significant. I'm sure many of us understand that. And none of us are going backward, except, I guess, Benjamin Button, but we're all aging. So I'm in my 30s, I'm trying to attract 20-year-olds. So you always want to make sure you have them there ready to go and ready to get involved. The same with the Horticultural Society. It's really interesting now, juxtaposed when you go to, say, the English Public Garden at the Orange Hall, and we all intermix, and we're all great friends now. We have barbecues and go to restaurants together, and there's 20, 30-year-olds, and there's 55, 60, 65, 7-year-olds. And they're all gardening, and and the 20, 30-year-olds are really happy to be there learning more about gardening and the growing zones and the conditions in Bonavista and so on and so on. So it's amazing to see when that happens. But yes, it takes tremendous human capital, a lot of social capital to get things moving. And there's bits and bobs of that dropped through the presentation as to why I was so focused on trying to get younger people, entrepreneurs and creators into the town, because I knew not to try to slight or stereotype any particular person or career, but creators tend to be more involved in the community as opposed to government worker blank, even if they are 20 or 30. They kind of just want to, sometimes I'm not labeling anyone, but I've seen in my own experience, and I have been a government worker in education, that they just want to live their life. Leave me alone. I've been busy all day, I've been with students, or I've been with patients because I'm a nurse or this or that. But creators, I think, generally, as a ratio, more of them seem to want to get involved and engage and do the extra bit, because they're kind of used to it. They're self-driven, they've invented something, they've created a product or service. They know, they put in the time, they get the reward. And that's been, a key to Bonavista's success so far.
I sit on a local municipal council, and one of the challenges is, and you touched on it earlier, is that a lot of time is focused on traditional infrastructure, potholes and sewer systems and all the stuff that we do need. But I tend to look more at the people as part of our social infrastructure that we need to invest in as well. And I'm assuming that the changes we've seen in Bonavista have led to different municipal investments or different way of spending the dollars that the municipality has. Would you have any suggestions on how to work with colleagues to help them see spending differently can derive different investments? And also, would you know what percentage of your budget is spent
Before you
more
even
on
say
those
it.
types of investments as opposed to traditional
Came up in Miramichi
infrastructure?
last night. They were impressed. I don't know what their ratios are. Our multi-million-dollar municipal budget, and I didn't understand really until I started going on this New Brunswick tour, that you guys have a completely different allocation of dollars, and it goes to the province, and you get so many cents back, and there's this kind of share. We collect all our tax money and keep it all. Yes. All of it. So anyway, so we're rewarded, job well done, we get all the money, because we did a good job. Province gets, some of the business tax, but they have their own business tax besides their own municipal business tax, completely separate. So, the town of Bonavista, and before even I was a councillor in my 20s, when I was a teenager in high school, I mean, when they were turning off the street lights, and our CFO at the time was literally, he tells the story quite a bit, back in the mid-90s, like calling banks and financial institutions week to week, trying to figure out how to balance the money so that we didn't go bankrupt that week. During that time was the time when the town made a decision to invest in the formation of the Townscape Foundation and give them an operating grant. When the roads were falling apart, lights were being cut, businesses were moving out for years, and we're going to invest in clapboard and heritage grants. And that's what they did. It was not all of them, it wasn't unanimous. I don't know the vote, I think it was 4-3. But anyway, it got through. And to pay for it, they doubled water sewer bills overnight. The following week, the windows were all broken out at the town hall and the staff couldn't get in for a couple days because of the demonstrations. But they stuck to it. They would not change it. They said, we're in dire straits. We need to have more money, need more revenue, because it's been slipping annually. Now it's up 10 to 12 annually every year. And we want to take that money we get from you guys and do this, and then have this planning charrette and form the Townscape Foundation. That was quite something in the moratorium 1990s to say and do that. So now fast forward to where we are. Bonavista spends somewhere between 22 and 24% of its entire municipal budget on heritage, culture, arts, on its multi-million dollar budget. It's quite a significant amount. We give a lot of operating grants. We do heritage grants, 50-50, besides the HPIP program. We support the Garrick Theatre to be a year-round venue as a social enterprise to the townscape. I think alone, we give $40,000-50,000 a year to them. Just write the checks. They're going out all the time. That's what we do with the increase in revenue, because it's proven successful. One of the latest endeavors is the idea of enhancing not just the economic wealth of the community, but the socio and mental health of the community. So the whole holistic socioeconomic well-being is now coming into play. Now we are in year 2 of planning, and the government just announced a few $1 million for us to do the Tipa Vista Wellness Foundation Center, which is on top of all the normal healthcare services offered in the community, which is going to be the first of its kind, a full holistic wellness center in rural Newfoundland, the only one in rural Newfoundland, where government staff, mental health and addictions counselors, physiotherapists, dietitians, along with private personal trainers, our municipal gym, our cardio, weight room, open gymnasiums, everything gets plopped together in a restored old building on the harbour. And now, with a pedway going to that, will be an older purpose school, which will be a lower no-cost childcare centre. So we're heavily investing in those liberal-leaning and socialist ideas, but we can afford to at this point, slowly but surely. But we feel it of great benefit to, and generally, Bonavista has reached a point now, in Newfoundland anyway, with so many proven successes that I find going to provincial departments, provincial ministers or bureaucrats, high-level bureaucrats, and federally, they very, very rarely will turn us down now. Bonavista is often, I don't want to say scolded, highlighted in various ways at provincial municipality meetings and so on for getting everything. But it's because we've stuck to our plan that we developed back in the late 90s with the Townscape Foundation and the town plan and then other plans that came out of that, branching in all directions. But we're constantly following them, step by step by step by step. We don't just reinvent and go in new directions every few years. And every single one is a building block being put up, like Jenga, with the end goal being incredibly successful and vibrant community, and we're getting there. And the government, provincial or federal, and their politicians especially, want to celebrate success as much or more than we do. They want to attach their name and their party to great things. So Bonavista's population is doing well. Bonavista had 31 new businesses open last year. Bonavista had 20-something new businesses open already in 2019, and we're not even halfway through the year. I mean, these are huge, huge numbers for Newfoundland, rural or urban. These numbers aren't matched in urban areas in St. John's, in St. John's or on the Trans-Canada. It's gotten to the point where the university is now studying us and what we're doing and how we're doing it. But I don't think it's very much new. It's just following that master plan, building one step at a time, and making strong, quantifiable, solid arguments to whoever will listen and has listened when it comes to funding agencies and municipal and provincial and federal politicians. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. It's very good. Couple of comments. I lived in Newfoundland in 1992 when the cod fishery just collapsed, and it was very traumatic. It was devastating for the Newfoundland people. The second thing is I'm going to be in Bonavista in 2 months with 39 Americans. The question I have...
We see a lot of Americans.
These are older Americans. And in 21 RVs.
Oh, wow.
So we'll take up all your parking. Question I have is, you indicated earlier in your presentation that you received $40 million in federal funding. What was your secret?
We have a lot of good proposal writers in our area. Myself, I've written a number of, I think, pretty solid proposals. We have a track record. Myself, a couple of friends of mine that are involved with various not-for-profits, the Townscape Foundation, Trinity Historical Society, Sir for Coker Foundation. I can do a list of 8 or 10 of us. We have a 100% success rate. I've never had a proposal written that's been turned down. And generally it's based on that building block formula, that we always build in pieces. Early stages of phase 2 are always in phase 1. And Bonavista is an example, early townscape projects, building critical mass in built heritage restoration, HPIP, rich grants, done. Woodworking shops and carpentry firms do well. Local contractors do well. Hardware stores pick up business. Okay, we've been successful 5 years later. Now we want to do streetscaping in around those neighborhoods. Quite unique. We make our budget go quite a ways in Bonavista. We put in very little of the sidewalk, lighting. We don't do boardwalks and all this type of thing. The townscape does all that for us and uses a COA funds to do it. But we then have it handed over to us after the project is done as municipal infrastructure. Generally, a COA doesn't fund a whole lot of infrastructure like that. So that's how we do it. It's been quite successful for us. But we've used legitimate arguments because we want a pedestrian area. We want a walking area, a biking area. We want these number of meters of sidewalk in this area of town to get to this area of town to flow tourists, of course, because COA loves tourists, and you know that's business, from one part of town to another. Now it's gravel, it's confusing, there's asphalt going everywhere. We need to scape the space to show them the way to business. And then you stimulate even more so that pocket of commercial buildings on that end of that cluster of sidewalks. So it really is step by step by step by step. We're also known for doing projects that are, say, A and C, and then there's a gap in the middle, project B. So now we're actually just put in a project B because we did one half of the harbour. Then we did the other side of the harbour. Now we've got to connect the two. So we need $1.7 million to do it. So we're looking for approval for that now. There's ways to do it as long as you can show tangibles, quantifiables for government agencies. Increase in visitation, increase in business activity or whatnot.
So is your Townscape Foundation, is that a not-for-profit working?
It's a not-for-profit organization. It runs the Garrick Theatre as a social enterprise with a separate board, but under the Townscape umbrella. And the Townscape runs arm's length from the municipal council. We get annual updates. We just had one last week, doing basically a Garrick Theatre breakdown over last year. And they get, as a result, if the reports are good, which they tend to always be good, then they get more operating grants from us because we give them peanuts and they grow a tree because they leverage the funds successfully. And we don't have the resources to do so at the town hall, nor the time. I don't want to write any more proposals than I have to.
Yeah. Yeah, great presentation. You just wowed me because I'm not a millennial. I'm a little older than the millennial.
That's okay.
But I remember Bonavista and those closed up buildings. I was there during the Cabot celebrations.
Oh, yeah.
The only time we'd come in from Newman's Cove was to get Ryder's Chicken, I believe. That was about it, and getting an ice cream. So
Yeah, that was it. An ice cream store and Riders, yeah.
And Ryder's, which burnt, I guess, later
Yeah.
on.
Mm-hmm.
But for every community, there's always those outlying communities, like the Newman's Coves, like the Ellistons,
Yes.
Plate Cove, and
Yep.
how is that affecting those outside communities?
Well, that's interesting. An urban geographer and planner, I can't remember his name now, was engaged early on with the Townscape Plan and the planning charrette in 1998 through 2003. Planning charrettes, many of them, sessions and open town hall sessions and things like that. And what they argued, so you're familiar with the area, was that traffic, even the local resident traffic in Bonavista, was one way. It was driving to Clarenville. It was driving to the Walmart town. And then they got a Canadian Tire, and then they got a this and a that. It was all up and off the peninsula toward the Trans-Canada. They come back in the evening with their stuff, and their money would be in that town. And that was problematic. And he lectured Bonavista, this planner, on how we need flow up and down the peninsula, and you need to secure yourself, safeguarding government infrastructure, your public college campus, your public schools, your hospital and healthcare facilities, government offices, ASAP, because the moratorium's in swing now, you're a town that's pretty crippled, and they're going to start cutting things. So you've got to be very protectionist over all your government services because they're going to be your anchor. And so we did. There were wars waged over keeping things, and now we're growing service. Our hospital just got a multi-million-dollar expansion commitment that'll start this fall. But again, it was a step-by-step process to make sure Bonavista is maintained as some level of a service community and actually grow the level of service through things like the Bonavista creative businesses and so on, that would actually draw people down from the Trans-Canada to Bonavista. So there'd be two-way traffic. There's still lots of people in Bonavista going all the time to Walmart. You ain't going to stop that. But at the same time, there are people coming from other towns within Newfoundland. Forget the tourists. They're not interested in the Trans-Canada generally. They're all coming down to us, so we're getting them anyway. When it comes to the local people, the residents of Newfoundland, there's now an up and down motion on the peninsula because top 100 restaurants in Canada. Up around the Trans-Canada area, 0. Bonavista area, 3, 5 years running, top 100 restaurants in Canada. We have year-round theater. We have amazing arts, culture, galleries, on and on and on and on. And not just summer, year-round, many of these things. So there is a movement down, and I really was amazed a couple of years ago when I was talking to a restaurateur, and I said, how you doing this spring, blah, blah, blah. And she said, oh, well, it was really busy last night. We had 3 tables from this particular town and another table from this particular town, and these were all modern Trans-Canada towns. And they came down, had a night, went to a restaurant, did some shopping, and then in a day or two went back to where they were from. And that was never before seen in Bonavista. So Bonavista has secured itself as an anchor service community. I no longer really worry about major cuts in Bonavista. We were just announced at our college campus that's where I used to work as program development and business development officer for College on the Atlantic campuses in Eastern Newfoundland. And the campus had been eroding for many years, like everything. And after a number of years of fighting and pushing, last year and now opening this fall, we have Newfoundland's provincial culinary school opening on the peninsula at our campus with lots of investment coming with that and supporting, of course, the local culinary economy that's become huge. So it kind of all snowballs. So how do the surrounding communities play into that? Elliston's population stabilized a couple of years ago and has grown ever since by about 5 to 6%. They have gone from 1 business in their community back around 2000, 2001, to now they have over a dozen. There's a community of about 330 people. Their municipal revenues are way up, and now they're investing in infrastructure in a much smaller version of what Bonavista's been doing. And they're 5-6 minutes drive from Bonavista, so there's a lot of commute as well. People are now seeing this a beautiful little hamlet off Bonavista, and I'm moving to work at the hospital or work at the college or here or there. I might live in Elliston. So they're also getting supported in that way because Bonavista is an employment anchor more and more. The Coves, not so much, Newman's Cove area. That is the last really economically crippled area on the peninsula. And I'm being recorded, so. The provincial government made a few unfortunate moves when it comes to the positioning of highways. But I say they kind of did it on purpose. And as highways were prioritized and moved around and removed from some communities and some sides of peninsulas and pushed through others for whatever reason at that time, very few people now drive through the Newman's Cove area. Very, very few. But slowly but surely there are pockets. And actually the earth science piece that I was talking on in Italy last year, and I'm headed to Indonesia now this fall to speak on it again as a UNESCO bid for us, based on our earth science assets. And the Newman's Cove, King's Cove area, it's all the Bonavista Bay side of our peninsula, very small, very rural, very economically depressed, entirely involved in the cod fishery historically. Towns of 100 here, 50 here, 200 there, 90 there, for about an hour's drive on the opposite side of the peninsula that the main highway is on. So you gotta go there and plan to go there. But there are pockets. There's a gallery open now, there's a new restaurant open, there's some accommodations opening, there's a whale and iceberg tour operator going out of there now. I just brought the Washington Post film crew there last week, and we spent 4 days in that area going and studying the remote, rural parts of Newfoundland. So they have assets themselves, and I think they're going to benefit from what's going on in the Bonavista area and the Elliston area, but it's just going to take time. It all takes time. It's a matter of if they can wait. The other challenge that I would end with on that statement is Elliston is incorporated as a municipality and as a council. Some of the areas on that side of the peninsula are not. So they have, this is talk 6 or 7 now in the last few days. So they have no revenue stream. They rely on provincial highways to go through with the plow to plow. They rely on surrounding communities and pay them a little few dollar token or whatever to pick up the trash and that sort of thing. So they have a harder time organizing themselves. I've been encouraging them to create a little regional council, but I think it'd be worthwhile. I'm a strong believer that all those communities have survived because they buy at our grocery stores and hardware stores and serve our hospital and everything. Bonavista is about 4,000, but in our surrounding area, it's 8,200 people year round. We need all those towns to survive or, we're in trouble. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I think a lot of people in this room either sit on municipal councils or they're staff members of council. And myself, I can relate in the sense that I work, I have a day job as well as I do on council. And when I started, a lot of people told me it's very hard to be on council and have a day job. You almost need to be retired. So you could probably guess where I'm going with this. How do you balance, I guess you could say our Municipalities Act is very broad, and maybe the definition of what a conflict of interest is one thing, and what's perceived in the public might be another. I was wondering if you have challenges wearing both those hats, because I certainly do, how you overcome them and how you balance them.
Lawyers. Resources. Yes, I currently, municipally, provincially, or nationally, sit on 17 organizations or boards, and I chair, co-chair, or vice chair a dozen of them. I also have my hands in 6 companies, these are 3, and I'm mayor. So there have been points in time where I have asked for, a conflict lawyer to call in to a meeting, and maybe a political scientist to show up, and a geographer to show up, and other specialties, because certain things arise, and I know there's going to be a perceived conflict of interest. I've divested a few things, but I mean, it is, we're paid a small amount of stipend in Newfoundland. I don't know if you're here, but I mean, it's not actually being paid, believe me. And I take my little stipend and donate it to the figure skating club because I'm a figure skating coach. So it's a challenge. It's a big reason why my phone's been vibrating this whole presentation and this whole trip, because I'm in perceived conflict on 2 issues right now. I will argue, and I think any academic or lawyer will argue that I'm not, but you just have to have very, very tough skin and assume that you're doing the best you can, you're doing what you can, and especially in small rural areas, if everything's going to be a conflict, you won't get anyone on your council because everyone is related to everyone. I mean, we have 3 people in the fishery, one that has a significant crab license holder on our council, and then 2 others that either work in management or on the line in our fish plant. And they're the majority of our committee that handles the fisheries sector that negotiates the tax rates for the fish plants. But they have a knowledge base and they try to be as fair as possible. But I mean, if you had to remove them from that, and then you had to remove, the contractor that's on council because, he's a contractor, he's a developer, and we're doing subdivision, and then we're really involved in heritage, and you remove me, there's nobody left. Retired or not, they're connected in one form or fashion. You can find conflict almost anywhere if you really want to dig. But we do our best to try to stay out of it. It doesn't really solve your conundrum, but my skin is tough and leathery at age 33. My heart is growing slightly colder. I should mention as well, since there are, interested people, obviously, with all the questions in the audience, that myself and others, through our Bonavista Regional Chamber of Commerce, we do host and package best practice missions to the Bonavista Peninsula. It's a group of volunteers. This isn't a cash grab. I'm not pitching anything. But we just hosted a group of about 20 from France. I've hosted Calgary and rural Alberta, BC, reps from Nova Scotia, I think last year. So they come in and spend a few days to upwards of a week in the area. They meet with not-for-profit people, municipal leaders, and so on and so on. And they get a feel of how the whole region works, and to touch on the earlier comment of how the municipalities all work together as well as a functioning economic zone. So if you did want to dive into that, or there are people or a group of people from New Brunswick that all want to come together and get a little best practice mission to come and see us, we're very happy to do so. We always donate our time to talk to people and try to help other regions out.
It's awesome. Thank you.
Yep.